I know we planted Andrea in the audience in case we need them to ask questions.
All right, hello everyone. You know where you are, but welcome back to Concordia University's Force-Based. Thanks for joining us for the next event today, Miss and Dis, Information in Media and Journalism in the Canadian Context. Just to let you know, once again, we are streaming to YouTube live from Force-Based, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. We're running this event also as a live stream Zoom meeting, so questions, comments, put them in the chat. People in the space, raise your hand, we'll get you a mic. That's enough for me. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to Professor in Journalism, David Secko. David, welcome in.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone to being here, and thank you to Brad and Vivek and everyone else that was involved in organizing this awesome conference. I'm really excited. I'm really excited with the panel we have, and my problem is I like to speak too much, so I'm going to try not to speak very much. But it is an interesting topic. It's a topic that's obviously on every journalist's mind. There's challenges with which how much of a role or how much of a responsibility does Journalism Canada have to deal with disinformation? How much of a responsibility do we have to help our students deal with this, to go in that kind of an element as we're dealing with this very important and very interesting topic that has lots of different dimensions. And I know there's been lots of discussion already today, so I won't kind of get into that or play with that, other than to say I'm going to introduce our panelists very quickly, and as is my custom, I know Liam and Lucy know me very well. I won't say much about your background, so if you could give us a little bit of a sense of who you are and where you're coming from, that would be awesome. But I want to introduce Jonathan, who's from the CBC, a senior investigative reporter, who I'm going to ask to speak for about 10 minutes first, once we get going. I want to introduce Lucy, who's a professor in the journalism department as well with us, as well as an affiliate in the history department. And I want to introduce Liam, who's also a professor. We're on the visual side in the journalism department as we go forward. So the four of us are going to have a little chat. I told everyone that we would gab about disinformation, that we might be like very, very gabby about it as we go forward. So I'm also going to invite the audience to just give me a quick hand signal if you want to ask a question, because really we want to get this over to people's ideas and the things we want to talk about as quickly as possible. But I'm going to ask each of our guests to talk for about 10 minutes. If it takes 5 minutes, fine. If it takes 15 minutes, I might be like, in there, but we'll kind of go from there. So thank you to everyone for the invite. Jonathan, I'm going to hand it over to you with the mic to start us off and take us in whatever direction you feel is important. So the only instructions I've given everyone is to talk about journalism and disinformation. So I have no idea where we're going to end up. And Brad, I'm sorry if we end up in a weird spot. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dave. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks, Andrea, for extending the invitation. By way of background, I won't say too much other than to mention that I'm a proud graduate of the diploma program in journalism at Concordia. I certainly wouldn't be where I am if it hadn't been for the excellent professors I had there. So as Dave mentioned, I do work with the investigative unit, the National Investigative Unit at CBC News. And I kind of have a particular beat there, which is in general, social movements, the intersection of social movements and democracy. For the past 2 years, though, that has essentially meant that I have reported almost exclusively on conservative activism, far-right activism, and other types of activism that targets minority rights. So you won't be surprised to hear that I encounter misinformation and disinformation on a pretty regular basis. So what I thought I would do is to kind of just give a brief overview of 3 general challenges that I think mainstream journalists face when it comes to reporting on or encountering disinformation in their work. This is kind of obviously observations that are very partial to me. They don't really amount to any kind of grand theory of disinformation. But hopefully some of it is new. So hopefully some of it is informative. And I think what I'm going to try to do is focus particularly on disinformation as opposed to misinformation. These are obviously deliberate attempts to mislead, which I think are the more pressing threat to democracy, and which I think journalists have a particular responsibility to respond to. So the first kind of set of challenges I want to talk about is the set of challenges posed by social media companies. I think most journalists encounter disinformation on social media sites. Misinformation is probably a bit much more widespread, or something you would encounter, say at a scene of a crime or an accident that you're reporting on. And it also may not be surprising to say that I think many journalists find that social media companies have not been particularly helpful when it comes to our efforts to report on disinformation. I think there was a brief moment in the early days of the pandemic when there was a somewhat concerted effort by some social media companies, Facebook and YouTube, what used to be called Twitter, to either demonetize accounts or to kick off accounts that were spreading disinformation. There was a big cleanup of QAnon accounts on Facebook. Trump was obviously removed from Twitter following the January 6th riots. That moment of willingness to crack down on disinformation seems to have passed, not just on Twitter under the new ownership of Elon Musk, but also on Facebook and YouTube. You see much less willingness on their part to crack down on disinformation. So it continues to proliferate there. But particularly the obstacle, it's a bit more technical, but I kind of want to raise it to people's attention, is that the social media, the infrastructure of these sites has progressively become less transparent. And so I think one of the tools that a lot of journalists use, or I should say, journalists, there are kind of a whole slew of online tools, digital tools developed by third parties that rely on open source technology, and that kind of operate as add-ons to Facebook or Twitter or YouTube that we use to track the spread of disinformation and to kind of identify the sources of it. And recently, there have been some, I think, fairly major changes to the infrastructure of these sites, which has really complicated our lives. So top of mind for me particularly is Meta's decision, which they recently announced that they're going to wrap up CrowdTangle. So CrowdTangle was a really cool tool that basically allowed you to kind of track how misinformation or disinformation was being spread within Facebook. And it allowed you also to kind of establish a timeline and to see who shared what when. And so that became very, very useful for pinpointing, if a particular politician, say, shared a bit of disinformation, so journalists could then hold that politician accountable. And it helped us kind of understand the mechanics of Facebook and how things go viral. And I'm certainly not alone. I think many journalists are really sad to see this tool go. Facebook's reasons for getting rid of it are a bit, they say it's not accurate, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of the journalism that came out of using CrowdTangle made Facebook look bad. It really illustrated that their attempts to crack down on misinformation and disinformation weren't sufficient to really stem the problem. And that's just one example. When Musk took over Twitter, he restricted access to the API, which we lost a lot of really good tools. One in particular, one favorite of mine, was a tool out of the University of Indiana called BotMeter, and basically you could put in a Twitter account and it would assign a score to that Twitter account basically trying to determine whether or not it was a bot. And you could do that not just for one account, but for several dozen, for hundreds of accounts. So it allowed you to identify bot farms. This was very, very useful. Now that's gone. Google Analytics has just recently changed the way it operates, and so it used to people who would sign up for Google Analytics. This is a service that allowed website developers to track their stats. And so anytime you sign up for an account, you were assigned a kind of a unique code. And that code would appear in the source code of a website. And so what a lot of journalists would do, and one of the guys who was really excellent at this is Craig Silverman, used to be at BuzzFeed, now at ProPublica, but basically you could, so if several different websites had the same UA code or the same identifier, you knew that probably the same person was behind all those websites. So again, that became very, very useful for identifying networks of disinformation on the web. That is now gone. And so I think social media companies haven't been and probably never will be dependable allies in the fight against disinformation. Their policies and their infrastructure are constantly changing, and that makes disinformation or reporting on disinformation very time consuming. It means that journalists who do encounter it, which is basically every journalist out there, really has to spend a lot of time kind of updating their skill set, making sure they're on top of the latest tools. The nice thing about a lot of these tools is that when one of them goes down, there's a whole army of hackers and people way smarter than me who understand Python and stuff like that out there developing new tools. But then it means you have to become aware of them, try them out, test them, and so I think it's really important for people to understand just how time-consuming doing good disinformation journalism is. Just mention briefly another set of challenges. I don't know how new this is, but it seems to me that political actors, politicians, have increasingly developed a vocabulary to kind of inoculate themselves from disinformation journalism or fact-checking. Obviously politicians lie, this is not new. It's not new that journalists would call them out for it. But it seems that increasingly what we're seeing is this kind of conflation by some politicians, some political actors between basic accountability and canceling. So that when a journalist would call out a politician, you say like, hey man, how come you spread this particular bit of disinformation? Often the response will be, how come you're trying to cancel me? My free speech, blah, 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 blah. And so I think this is kind of part of the broader weaponization of free speech. Was probably a topic for another day, but I think one of the things that I've really noticed is the extent to which fact-checking itself, which I think I think we can all get behind or journalists get behind as a good thing, has become politicized, and you see, and this happens both on the right and the left, where you see people trying to either claim that fact-checking is ideologically biased. Why are you always checking my facts? Well, maybe it's because you're the one who keeps on bending them. Or you also see partisan efforts to kind of to say, oh, we're fact-checking, when in fact it's partisan communication, and so they're trying to ape or they're trying to appropriate the legitimacy of fact-checking to kind of launder the partisan nature of their communication. And I think the combination of this kind of resistance to fact-checking it hurts fact-checking. It hurts the legitimacy of the enterprise, which I think lives and dies on the appearance of neutrality or the appearance of objectivity. And I think finally, one of the things I want to suggest, and this is maybe a bit anecdotal, but I saw that the previous panel kind of hinted on it, and I see Professor Carignan there, so maybe she can correct me. But I think one of the things that's happened is news audiences, news consumers have developed the capacity to hold small amounts of conspiracy theories without becoming conspiracy theorists. Just in everyday conversation, you hear, things like, "Oh, I'm just asking questions." Just pointing out a coincidence. Or I'm not racist, but and then insert some, dubious crime statistic. And I think what it suggests to me is, again, and there was this Leger poll that came out, I think late last year, that said that the headline of the poll was like 79% of Canadians believe in at least one conspiracy theory, and it's like, what? That's nuts. But you break it down, and it's fact, much more like believe somewhat than really believe. And they'll believe one or two, but not many believe all conspiracy theories. And so I think this kind of raises a question of what's more concerning? A lot of people believing in a little bullshit, or a small amount of people believing in a lot of bullshit. And I actually think it's the former. I actually think what's concerning is that if you have a lot of people believing in a little bullshit, what happens is that bullshit it circulates. It's not challenged. It lingers. It travels from the fringe into the mainstream much more easier, and then kind of stays there and festers. And I think this is quite pernicious, because I think disinformation is at its most powerful, its most insidious, when it exists alongside factual information, because it can easily be mistaken for factual information, and it has this kind of symbiotic relationship with factual information, right? People with medical degrees spreading misinformation or disinformation about COVID, right? That relies on their credentials. And so, I think that's, and I think it's important to keep in mind, really, I think for journalists, one thing I think we're not very good at is we're not very good at appreciating how complex a cognitive task it is for news consumers to navigate the information world. So one thing I kind of think about is reporting about pharmaceutical companies. Journalists, there's like no shortage of excellent journalism about how corrupt the pharmaceutical industry is. Pharmaceutical industry is giving kickbacks to doctors for pushing certain prescriptions, the overprescription of painkillers, off-label drug use. And at the same time, the message during COVID was, no, but for these vaccines, they're cool. They're safe and effective. Now, like, both of those things are true, but that's like actually a quite, at least to me, it seems like a quite complex cognitive task. Be critical, but only so critical. Disbelieve everything, but also believe some things. Some sources are trustworthy, other sources aren't. And I think journalists, we really have to kind of keep how difficult and how complex and how challenging that task is in mind. And I think the upshot of that is for us that, that fact-checking is not enough. Like, there has to be a kind of a broader effort to empower audiences to be able to navigate that complex information landscape. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully I've said something enough to anger somebody to provoke a response.
Okay. Hello again, everyone. So please do not believe that I'm an expert. I just got double booked. It happens. So super happy to see you again. So this morning, I talked about media literacy and some strategies to improve media literacy. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about history. History of disinformation, super quickly. If you were here this morning, the last 3 slides are the same. The rest is different. So, why history? So as I was saying this morning, I'm teaching a class on disinformation and also would like to do a research project on the history of disinformation. And the reason is that I'm a historian, but I think also it brings a different perspective to the topic, and I think it can help engage people more in this topic. So here I listed a couple of reasons why I think the history of disinformation can be a fruitful avenue to explore. The first is super scholarly. I think it brings a different perspective to the when was journalism born debate. It's a super scholarly thing that doesn't really impact daily life. But I found the first anti-disinformation law from the 1500s, so maybe that could, bring something to the table. So other reasons why I think history of disinformation is a good way to talk about disinformation. I think it really enables students to kind of take a step back. It's less overwhelming because we look at things in a more longue durée perspective. We can make fun of some silly things while also exploring more serious topic, but it has less urgency, it's less stressful. They don't feel call out like, oh, you're on TikTok and there are fake news. No, let's talk about 18th century Oaks where a woman was giving birth to rabbits. And they're ha ha ha. Well, this is a good avenue to talk about science and science denial. So I think it's an interesting, pathway into that kind of topic. Again, in a more maybe scholarly way, the things I'm more interested in, I think we can see patterns of disinformation emerging in terms of content, so topic, in terms of intent as well. And it really sheds light on the how and why disinformation exists. And in the same vein, it sheds light on disinformation today, because nothing is new. Besides technology, I'm looking at you, Liam, AI. But yes, besides that, there is nothing new here. And I think it's also very useful as a way to open discussions about racism, xenophobia, misogyny, sexual violence, all these topics that are very, very prevalent in disinformation and conspiracy theories. And again, we're looking at that from a very distant perspective in terms of chronology, and then we can walk through centuries and talk about now. And it's an easier, I think, less confrontational way of approaching these topics. So in my very brief presentation, I'm going to give an example of 3 topics. Content. So here I'm going to mainly talk about anti-Semitism. The second is going to be intent. I decided not to talk about political propaganda. I felt the panel before, as well as you, Jonathan, already touched about far-right politics. And finally, illiteracy, and again, going back kind of to the issue on media literacy. So we're going to walk through history in just a couple of slides for each topic and see the connections between the past and now. First, something I already briefly mentioned this morning is the blood libel. So we're going to look at the roots of Wayfairgate, Pizzagate, and the adrenochrome conspiracy. So it started all in the 12th century as a rumor spread in England where Jews were murdering Christian children. They were using their blood either for bath or to make Passover bread. Pogroms ensued. Kings banned Jewish communities for the kingdom, seized their estates, and the church also passed very anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic laws. The rumors continued in Europe. We find them again 14th, 15th, 16th century. In the 18th century in Paris, there were a lot of rumors, and it was also printed in the press that the police was abducting children. And noble people, the king included, would bathe in their blood to cure their ailments. Other people were thinking that maybe the children were sent in North America to populate the new colonies. And some popular revolts happened in Paris. All of this continued, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. In the 1890s, almost 80 murder trials against Jewish people in Eastern Europe for alleged ritual murders of children. Of course, false. We see the same thing in New York. Disappearance of child nearly caused pogrom in early 20th century US. And as I just said, we have then Pizzagate, Welfaregate, adenocrine stories. It's no longer necessarily the Jewish community, even though there is a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. But it could be a little bit everyone. Usually you have the elite. It can be also downright racist, such as this post on Facebook in Ontario 2019. Here it's definitely like moral panics, a widely reposted story where kids in malls, moms find them half abducted, quote, by, where is it? People not of Canadian descent, because they probably ask for their passport to establish that, so we know what they mean. And it's the same story. They're going to abduct children. Is it organ theft? Is it going to be for a sex ring? We don't know. But we still have these same stories, and the guilty party varies depending on sensitivities. Usually, who are we pointing the finger at? And I put like hashtag save the children, because it's how these rumors and stories are spreading, because everybody wants to save the children. So here, this kind of long-term disinformation, conspiracy theories. My goal with this example was just to show how they can be a point of entry towards discussing anti-Semitism, racism in fake news on the internet, and from 12th century Europe to 2019 Ontario. My next topic, my next topic was for-profit fake news, and it's where I'm just plugging my first anti-disinformation law. It's an apostolic constitution by the Pope from 1572, written against writers, propagators, or scribes of the bulletins called avvisi. It's an Italian word that means advice, and it was how were called the first newsletters that were created in 14th century Italy, written by merchants, and they were giving political, commercial news for other merchants. And very quickly, already in the 16th century, news writing in newsletters had become a real trade. And the center of trade was then Venice. People had subscribers, they were compiling news. There is a fantastic research group in Europe looking at all the history of these early newsletters. And here the Pope writes about the people who write every piece of news concerning public and private affairs, of which they come to know, or which through their malice they invent, regarding the country and abroad, mixing without any restraint the false, the true, and the uncertain. And he talks about the fact that they do it for a base profit, and send this news gathered from the voice of people, blah, blah, blah. And so it's forbidden to compile such summaries in the future, seeking to receive, copy, disseminate. Absolutely didn't work, huge trade, and 50 years later, the first newspapers were printed. So, for-profit fake news, we have them here already. Let's say mainstream media was already accused of being fake news in the 16th century. And I think one of my favorite for-profit fake news, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, is the Grain Moon Hoax. Published in 1835 in The Sun, which was a penny press based in New York. So very, very cheap, very affordable newspaper when newspapers started to be a commodity and affordable. Basically, The Sun ran a 6-part series on how a scientist from Scotland had discovered that the moon was actually populated by human bats. I think there was also some sort of groundhog people. They were naked, fornicating. It was scandalous. They also had plates, as you can see, with deep fakes of the moon people. And The Sun made a fantastic profit from this story, jumping from 4,000 copies in terms of circulation to 19,000 while they were running this story. The multimedia material, of course, was used to really strengthen the veracity of this story. Whether people believed it or not is, let's say, discussed, but it was delightful. And of course, it's delightful. And we still have for-profit fake news today. So of course, clickbait, concocted websites. Some are, serve a political purpose. Some are just like click farming. And my favorite here is this very small screenshot of Ontario man loses $11,000 in Trudeau deepfake scam. And because Trudeau had invested in this, he thought that, it was a very trustworthy investment. So there is still a lot of fake news for profit, not just for political gain, even though political gain is a big one. And my last one is, so connect to this morning when I was talking about expertise and how sometimes it's very difficult for people to understand who's an expert and how you build expertise. So here I've picked the topic of history denial, which exists on a very broad spectrum. So from downright denial, the Holocaust never existed, to really downplaying what was happening. So, oh, it's not 6 million people, that's not possible, maybe 100,000. And so the history of history denial is also very long, so we can start even, with colonization or slavery. Here on this slide, I picked the first book denying the Holocaust, published in North America in 1976, and a pamphlet that we can find in a lot of places, so that it's fake news, people lied, and this and that. So who are the experts interviewed? Sometimes there are, actual professors. There are mistakes being made. Jordan Peterson was a professor, and she is now no longer a professor, but and here, this is going to be familiar to some of you. The wonderful Indian residential school research group based here in Canada that does residential school denialism, as I was saying this morning. And some people are affiliated here with the University of Manitoba. It's just that they are alumni, but just having the name of your university next to your byline make you already a legitimate person. So yeah, history denial works also very well with students. It's a topic that they engage with, and it's a good opportunity to talk about how science is made and how to assess the expertise of someone. So the last slide is really more of a little poke to Andrea and David. Maybe for our Jour Ops, for our journalistic opportunity website, there is a student journalism conference held in Toronto by the Democracy Fund to discuss misinformation, fact-checking, and reporting on forbidden topics because there are challenges with civil liberties. And so you already know, some of you, oh, it's not here? Yes. And it's organized by Rebel News and True North and funded by the Democracy Fund. Yes. So here we go, expertise on journalism.
Oh, that was great history lesson for me, thank you. My name's Liam Maloney, and my background and my interest, I guess, in disinformation stems from my career as a photojournalist. And going back to 2014, 2015, I was covering the Syrian war and looking at the impact of the conflict on civilians. And I started to notice a very high quantity of disinformation being produced, possibly by Russian sources, but also by sort of state actors and non-state actors alike, who had particular theories on the nature of the conflict and where the money was being received. And this was my first indication that something was seriously wrong. And a lot of these stories were distributed on social media, almost exclusively on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And this was concerning, and I think, photojournalism is really about the veracity of the image, or the still image, or the moving image if you're a video journalist. And photojournalists, unlike maybe some print reporters, have to be really close to their subjects to tell the story. I mean, often you're talking about being at arm's length from the news that's happening in front of you. And so there's a particular pride taken in getting the story right and making sure that what you do is verifiable, and that you're not participating unwittingly, perhaps, in distributing false or erroneous information. In 2018, I started experimenting with a generative adversarial network called Big GAN that was produced by Google, and it was maybe one of the first text-to-image algorithms that was out there that you could experiment with. If you kind of knew your way around basic coding, you could generate images that were as strange as they were kind of oddly compelling. They had more in common with kind of expressionist art from the post-World War I period than they did with anything that we could call a photograph. Fast forward to today, and in the last year alone, 15 billion images have been generated by a variety of different AI image generation algorithms. Midjourney, DALL-E, there's a whole bunch of them, Firefly. Now, to put things into context, from 1826, which is when the first photograph was made, to 1975, the sum total of all photographs taken by photographers was 15 billion. So in the space of 1 year, we have already surpassed the total quantity of historical photographs that we have at our fingertips. That's a disturbing thing to consider, especially when you think about the possibility for AI to generate images that are reasonable facsimiles of reality, but that promote or are used to promote disinformation. I think there's a recent Statistics Canada poll that came out that suggests that 43% of Canadians don't trust what they see on the internet. You can read that one of two ways. Either that's good, that we are skeptical, or it presents some existential threat to journalism. So that's my concern, and that's what I'm interested in speaking about today. If anyone has any questions or comments about that stuff. Thanks.
So I'm gonna make sure my mic is on, which I believe it is. And thank you, Jonathan, Lucy, Liam. Fantastic. I'm gonna stop my timer and kind of go from there. The goal here was to have the panelists introduce themselves a little bit, have them kind of speak a little bit about the things that strike them. And I think within that, there's lots of ideas that we can disentangle. I always have tons of questions, but I'm gonna invite the crowd to begin to think about questions they might wanna ask. If Andrea's still here, I'm gonna get her to ask one. But I think I wanna start, Jonathan, if you're okay with it, like going whatever direction you want, but ending with what Liam was talking about, this idea of, you know, we had this many photographs, now we have this many photographs that may represent this, that, or the other, and those may or may not be plugging into disinformation debates or some of the things that journalists might be worried about, but that Canadian society might be worried about as well. And connect that with some of what you're talking about, the importance of things lingering, because that's one of the things I wrote down and underlined. I can no longer remember why, but I know it struck me that like this idea of information and things lingering in a different way than they used to is potentially one of the components that we might want to unpack from a journalist perspective. And then I'll ask Lucy to kind of dive in with this idea that nothing's new, we're still there, or maybe something has changed. If you don't mind passing the mic to Jonathan there, it's not really a question to begin with, but more of this idea of what are you thinking about after hearing the other two speakers, and how does this idea of, you know, AI, all the things we're generating, it's not just AI, it could be bot farms, it could be all the things you talked about, and how things seem to linger potentially longer than they once did.
Yeah, well, I'd really love to hear Lucy's thoughts about like the historical dimension of what Liam just mentioned, and you know, like the history of photography and the history of the image, and the way that photography was valued in a way because it was real, it was true, and this was, you know, obviously one of the ways that it distinguished itself from art, and it helped establish it as a form of mass culture. This is way outside my expertise, so I'll let you guys speak about that. I think though, like what Liam, you kind of mentioned about that statistic about was it 43% of Canadians don't trust what they see, and there being kind of two ways to look at it, and so this, I think you hit on something that causes me a great deal of indecision or confusion. So it does seem like with the mass production of text and image, be it by actual people or through AI, one of the results of that is there's this kind of like a leveling, right? And we see that in I think the way that audiences respond to this kind of mass amount of information out there. It all looks the same to them, and I think one of the principles that modern journalism has relied upon is that we're different. That media somehow mediates. Like we have a function, like a triage function, and that what we produce is somehow better, more reliable, has some kind of value that distinguishes it from the mass amount of information out there. At the same time, there is something kind of like not very democratic about that, you know? And this is a tension within journalism, whether or not to professionalize journalism or to kind of, you know, embrace citizen journalism. But yeah, so I mean, you know, I think there's one way of reading the explosion of data, the explosion of images, the explosion of text as like as a good thing, as kind of like the next step in the Gutenberg revolution. This leveling, while it can on the one hand can mean equality, it does, again, I think, to come back to a point I made earlier, increase the cognitive task on the citizen to exercise their critical functions as to what to trust, what to believe in, how to interpret it. And I think as journalists, we can no longer kind of take for granted that what we produce will necessarily be trusted, will necessarily be believed. And I think that has changed. You know, as I've been a journalist for about 15 years, that has changed in my lifetime. I think, you know, I started my career at the Canadian Press, and we were like, yeah, we're the Canadian Press, we're the wire service. Everybody loves the wire service. We do no wrong. Now I work at the CBC, and boy, let me tell you about my inbox and the kind of hate that I get. And it's very clear to me that you know, journalism can no longer kind of rely on the prestige it once had.
Lucy, please.
Yes, okay. Well,
Come on, tell me the truth.
okay, well, so earlier I said things didn't change in terms of the intent of disinformation, but of course, like I agree, I'm really interested in what you're saying, that the current climate requires a higher level of cognitive work from our audience, and I agree. And absolutely, I agree also that once upon a time, journalists had a certain standing in society with the mayor and with the doctor of the town, and they were kind of the truth tellers. I was thinking at the beginning, it's completely going in all sorts of directions. I was thinking about the moon landing, so not the great moon ox, but the moon landing, and like, you know, right away people were like, oh, this is false, because you could always fake pictures and videos already back then. Yeah, no people, no real humans on the moon either in the 60s. Yes, I don't know what to say.
I mean, maybe I can cite an early historic example of, you know, a fake image or a faked image. It's actually one of the first photographs ever taken during a conflict by Roger Fenton during the Crimean War. And the photograph was titled "In the Valley of the Shadow of Death," and it pictured a roadway littered with cannonballs, hundreds and hundreds of cannonballs. The cameras back then, you know, needed to be mounted on heavy tripods. The exposures were often many seconds long. And so there are no people in the image, but the cannonballs tell the story. And this was widely distributed at the time as an example of the horrors of that conflict. Much later, another negative turned up, and it seemed to indicate that the cannonballs had been on the side of the road, and that Fenton had placed a whole bunch of cannonballs in the foreground of the picture to make things look more dramatic. So this is nothing new, but I think what's changed is the volume. You know, on the eve of the election in 2020, something like 1 in 4 images that dealt with political subject matter were deemed to be fake, and that was, you know, 3.5 years ago. I think what we're going to see this year, this November, is going to be an order of magnitude worse than that.
So we have this cognitive stress, this cognitive kind of sense of people have to doing it. We've talked about a little bit about the history and the back and forth, if there's anything new, the abundance of images that might be coming out, and potentially one of the differences being the volume. But one of the things I want to ask you, Liam, if we can go back around through this, and I don't know if this will take us in a discussion area, but why did Fenton take that photograph? Why do you think he made that fake photograph? And do you think the reasons, to see where I'm going here, the reasons today for people to do these kind of things or to be involved in disinformation, are they the same they've always been? Or are we on a new cusp of that also changing? Like how we engage with it, why someone might do it, how a journalist might feel about it?
I mean, I can't speculate on what Fenton was thinking.
Fair enough. When
he made this picture, but I imagine that probably it's the same idea that has motivated other people in history to fake images or manipulate images, and that's because they felt like they needed to insert their point of view into some historical context. And so in a way, the motivation maybe is not that different. I think the problem now is that when false images are used as part of a disinformation campaign and audiences can't distinguish real from fake, then there's sort of a general collapse in the sort of in the plausibility of journalism as a way to keep us informed. And I really do think it poses an existential threat to the industry unless we take serious steps to combat it and create, you know, teams. I mean, this already exists, of course. There are people who are doing fact-checking at all layers of the journalistic process. But I think that we're going to need a lot more people to do that. It's probably going to become, you know, 50% of the job is having this intake of information and being able to say with, you know, with real conviction that something is not real and why it's not real and who produced it. And so I think tools, you know, like image verification tools that have been put to use by open source intelligence gathering networks and investigations, groups like Bellingcat and Forensic Architecture, as well as the New York Times Visual Investigations Desk, they're employing these kinds of image verification tools that are actually highly effective and that offer kind of bulletproof evidence that something is either real or not real, whether it involves geolocation and chronolocation techniques or other techniques to find out where the source of the images originate from. I think that is the kind of thing that will win over the public in the long term. But it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of staff.
Lucy, things to add? Jonathan, I'm looking at you because I can see you nodding, I can see your brain going, but I want Lucy to continue this kind of thread of reasoning and thinking and changes.
Well, my view on this is that fact-checking, it's already too late. And that's the big thing, because if you already saw the picture and it was something that really moved you, you already made up your mind, and chances are you're not gonna probably read the disclaimer from, I don't know, the New York Times, because you saw the post on your Instagram feed or on TikTok, and you're not gonna look at the New York Times and their latest story about how this pictures was fake. So I think that's the main issue, is that it needs to be kind of filtered before being out there. And likewise, when there is misinformation, so just an honest mistake, let's say you read a story on the CBC website, you're not going to click again on the story once you read it, even if there was a small mistake and they corrected the story, you're not going to revisit the same, I think, story twice. So for me, the challenge here is to fact check before. I mean, but it's not possible because of social media companies. They have no interest in doing so. So yeah.
So I want to push back gently. It's not really push back, but I think I just want to highlight something that Liam said, and so some of the I should put this. I think fact checking sounds boring, and a lot of it is boring. It's like not very exciting to read. It's essential. I could not do my job without all these other great websites that are devoted to fact checking. But I think one of the things that Liam hit upon when he kind of talks about visual investigation and why a lot of that is compelling, why a lot of what Bellingcat and the New York Times and BBC, it's not just like the goal isn't just or shouldn't just be to say this is real, this is not real. It is also to say who produced this and why. And I think that's where fact checking can have a more sustainable effect with viewers. And so if you conduct a very good bit of disinformation journalism, if you catch a fake and you say, so I'm just going to draw more on Liam's example in Syria, and you say this bit of fake imagery is actually a bit of Russian propaganda, and they're producing it because they want to advance this narrative in this particular region of the world. I think that, or at least my naive hope, is that goes further and helps. There's kind of like a long-term educative effect among news audiences. Which helps them deal with the problem, Lucy, that you raised, that a lot of it is just going to circulate, and that once you're exposed to it, it is kind of too late in a way. But if by the kind of ecosystem of journalism, you've already kind of learned to think critically about images and who potentially produced them and why, the hope is that you have more like a more critical resources to be able to unpack images that may or may not be real. And I think one of the things that's very important, I think, for journalists to think about when they encounter disinformation, it's not produced randomly. Like there are political goals behind disinformation, and I think it's incumbent upon journalists to explain as much as they can, what those goals are. Why is this being produced? What is the narrative here? What racist stereotypes are being traded upon in this meme? Because I think that's where journalism, I think now maybe we'll see if this plays out, but maybe journalism is kind of entering a new phase where it's not simply reportorial, but more civic-minded journalism where we have an eye on building the democratic resources necessary to sustain democracy or something like that. I don't know.
Lucy, I'm going to invite the crowd to begin to think about if they have questions and just to ask for a mic. And Andrea, I'm looking at you if no one else puts their hand up. Oh, they're already in there. But Lucy, Liam, I want you to just finish the thoughts here while the first question comes, because who knows where we'll end up in 5 minutes with questions, right? Please.
I absolutely agree. I had in mind many young people who find information primarily on TikTok and Instagram, and now it's mainly created content, so by influencers, and it's less. But I agree, and it's the kind of journalism I really enjoy as well. It's super interesting and very important.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. I think that, as you say, fact-checking is sort of a distinctly unsexy term, but that doesn't mean it It has to be that way. And I think maybe it's another way to engage audiences with material and provide much needed context to complex geopolitical situations that require explanation at every step of the process of reporting on them. And so maybe this is just another part of our toolkit as reporters that we need to take a lot more seriously and really step up our game because of the tidal wave that's coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Liam. So I see that there's a question, and there might be other ones as we go to take us in new and different directions. We have a good panel of journalists that want to, argue with each other, but not exactly. So we'll see where this goes as we go. Please.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was terrific. Here is an anecdote that goes to the point that you all have highlighted here, how when pointed out often by journalists, oftentimes that disinformation is presented by certain quarters as censoring conservatives. And that takes me to the issue of false equivalence. The idea that, well, everybody lies, everybody, it's after their own political bid, therefore, it's all the same, it doesn't matter. And that is the most dangerous position we can be in. But here's an anecdote. So I work in a team that includes a couple of communication professors from Clemson University who received, who were called upon by the NSF for a project in which they have been working called Spot the Troll, which basically does what you were saying, pointing out that all this disinformation that comes from Russian bots. And basically they were able to trace, using their own AI tools, the source of the information to Russian farms. That seems to be something good for society, right? Certainly for democracy in the US. Well, Ted Cruz senatorial office sent the NSF a letter shaming them for working with these two guys who are spotting Russian trolls because that is censoring conservatives. So this is the kind of upside down world we are in.
What do you want to hear about this? Question?
I want a sense of what can be done in the face of this. I have a hard time.
It goes to Jonathan. It's like, here you go, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot, Lucy.
Please finish, please.
I mean, we have received another letter from the NSF, our team, more general letter saying that we have to comply with this request for information from the Jim Jordan panel team. And basically they're looking for anything they can find to shame the NSF for funding projects that unmask disinformation. So what can we do collectively to push back?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real issue. The New York Times recently had a very good article about this, about basically the concerted conservative effort in the U.S. to push back at the Biden administration's efforts to curtail election misinformation, and other nonpartisan efforts to curtail. I mean, because I think in the U.S. the threat to democracy is quite measurable in terms of the amount of disinformation that is being produced both domestically and abroad. And I don't have a good solution except to kind of illustrate, to kind of talk about the conundrum or the moral dilemma that media companies, find themselves in, because, on the one hand, there's definitely a sense among certain political parties that fact-checking is one-sided, and so, if media companies continue along that line, we risk alienating potential audiences. We risk appearing partisan. And on the other hand, if we don't do it, we're kind of giving up one of our essential duties in a democracy. And so there's no easy answer. I mean, I hope to kind of give a sense where I think, we should fall upon the issue. But all that to say is that that disinformation, again, it benefits people. It's not produced randomly. It benefits people, and people deploy it for economic gain, and they deploy it for political gain. And journalists have to be very sensitive or very aware of the fact that that efforts to counter disinformation are threatening to people, and there is a pushback. There is a pushback, and it's taken I think particularly in the misuse of free speech and freedom of expression, and we have to steel our resolve against that stuff and drill down and kind of hope that. If you'll pardon this disquisition on democratic philosophy, and hope that, the journalism that we produce about disinformation, about who benefits from it, that those politicians will pay an electoral price. And that somehow that's, a market signal or something like that will be reinforced.
Lucy, I'm not going to let you away like just handing it over to Jonathan. Thoughts on this level and about the pushback against?
Yeah, if the CBC is doing investigation on disinformation, it's because it's belongs to Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, and they're trying to just silence the Conservative. So there is no win.
If you think of the Washington Post's credo, which is democracy dies in darkness. The darkness that we inhabit today, I think, has a lot to do with how polarizing disinformation tends to be. And I don't think we've seen south of the border, but in this country as well, I don't think we've seen the degree of polarization that we're witnessing right now. I don't think we've seen that in decades, maybe, over a century. And it's deeply discouraging. I'm not sure how to extricate ourselves from this, except by using these tried and true principles of journalism, which are to fact check, remind people, what's real and what's not real, and shine a light on these issues. But I guess we'd better figure it out pretty quickly.
Liam's point, I think, just triggered something in my mind. The notion that journalism is in some kind of existential crisis, I think that's real. But I think that the danger of being in a crisis mindset is to think that we need to throw off all the principles that we have relied upon. And I think, Liam's comment kind of reminded me, well, actually, the tools in our toolbox, I'm about to mix all kinds of metaphors here, but we have the tools in our toolbox. Like fact-checking is not a new thing. It may be boring and it may be unsexy, but it does the job, and it's there. We have been doing it for, Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong, decades. Professional journalism, I don't know, 1920, whatever. But like a lot of it isn't new, and a lot of it, I think but there is a danger where, like, we think we have to reinvent the wheel, and in doing so, we may depart from some of the principles that are tried and true and effective at countering a lot of this nonsense.
I think one of the, it's just an opinion, greater challenge is to reach the people, because they're no longer in the boat. They're no longer listening or watching or reading the CBC. They are already elsewhere. And personal anecdote, my in-laws are deep into the True North, Rebel News, BS, and it's like my partner called them, we were watching the news on YouTube. And my partner is like, sounds sketchy. It is. And there is, I don't know how to talk to them. And when I said, I'm working at the journalism department, mainstream media. And they're not going to open the CBC website, and a lot of people are not going to, because their opinion is already made. So my question is more, as journalists or educators, how can we reach out to them, touch them, be able to talk to them, because their concerns are real, or maybe they just, of course they're not blaming the right things for their problems, but we need to be able to talk to them because they feel that they've been left out, and we need to be able to connect. And I think that's another challenge. So then we can talk about fact-checking, and I mean, fact-checking is fun. It's kind of doing a little investigation. I think it's a super engaging thing to do. But yeah, first issue is how to connect with them.
I mean, we talk about the toolkit that journalists use to do this work, but maybe that toolkit should be more accessible to the general public. We have, all kinds of very accessible open source investigation tools that anybody with a modicum of knowledge of how to use, an application or, go to a website can use to help assist them to verify that what they're looking at is real. You can conduct a reverse image search. That takes no time. It's really a few clicks. And that can often determine whether the picture you're looking at was taken yesterday or 3 years ago in another country. And that can often very quickly be done by individuals, not just by journalists. And so perhaps part of our job is to, democratize the process of verifying media that comes up on our feeds. You were talking about new AI tools that journalists can use to verify, was it you? Or was it Andrea? Oh, yeah, somebody was talking about it, which is an interesting concept as well, but potentially has this sort of Ouroboros effect, snake eating its tail, but we'll see. But I'm interested in where we can take this technology that currently seems like an existential threat and then use it to our advantage to get stuff done more efficiently and more quickly. Yeah.
Awesome. So while the crowd is thinking, is there already another question?
We have about 3 questions. In
Okay,
the
because I was gonna start talking. Questions, please. More, that's better than me chatting.
So this one's for Liam. I mean, fact checking is a big topic, so maybe I'll stick to images. I heard that Facebook is going to be starting an AI image verification very shortly to put in the little notes in the corner which ones are AI images. I don't know how accurate it's going to be or how possible it is or where the technology really is. But do you think that is something like not just, maybe do you think people would be skeptical if news sources like CBC and Reuters and things like that have their own verification photo process in which they almost like little like stamp like you have on food, like organic food, little like real image kind of situation, and maybe some transparency process?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the wire services like Reuters and Associated Press and Getty Images already have all sorts of verification tools at their disposal because they're receiving images not just from people in their employ, but citizen journalism as well, and have been for many years. So they need a process that can reliably detect fake images or AI-based images. And I think the idea that if we encounter images that are generated by AI in our feeds, the idea that that can be flagged automatically with some degree of reliability, hopefully greater than 75%, let's say, that's probably not a bad thing. I guess the risk is that it doesn't work properly and that real images get flagged as fake ones. I think that there needs to be, unfortunately, I think there needs to be, even if this technology is deployed across all social media, I think there still needs to be somebody at the end of the line who says, thumbs up or thumbs down, this is real, this is not real.
Sorry, or the news company itself that can create such a kind of gold standard that that people can actually rely on, or is that too big of a process because it's, country borders?
I mean, I think that more than media companies, I think that tech companies probably have more resources to throw at that kind of problem solving, and I think it should be part of their responsibility to do so. I think that's part of being a good steward of the internet. If you design a product that millions or billions of people use every day, then you also need to make sure that there are certain safeguards in place to prevent the erosion of democracy. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Well, we're going to the next question. Jonathan, can you just jump in for a quick moment on this, if you don't mind? Because you talked about Facebook and their responsibility and that they may not like to do it. And where my mind went, and people are getting to know me as I talk, was like, oh, does an organic sticker on things get you to buy organic cucumbers? Or things like that. And just kind of weave this together, and then we'll go to the next question with some of the things you said at the very, very beginning.
Yeah, so I think one of the existing issues with social media companies and misinformation, disinformation is that actually a lot of these companies have very extensive policies that would conceivably prohibit the circulation of disinformation on their platforms, but they just don't uphold their own policies. And there's quite a bit of citizen activism out there, basically just dedicated to having Facebook or YouTube or whoever follow their own guidelines. There's a big Supreme Court case in the US, I believe it's Biden v. Missouri, it's just before the Supreme Court, and basically, to the point made earlier, the Biden administration was trying to get social media companies to follow their own guidelines and prevent the spread of misinformation about COVID-19. Conservatives in the U.S. have interpreted that as an attack on free speech, and that's basically the crux of the Supreme Court case. And basically, what it's about is whether or not the Biden administration can ask social media companies to follow their own guidelines. It's not really about government overreach. It's about whether or not the government can ask, Facebook or Meta or whoever to follow their own guidelines. Separately, I think there is, a policy issue which Canada is currently debating, and I think a lot of countries are currently debating. So based on the observation I just made, can social media companies be trusted to regulate themselves? And I think that's a question that a lot of politicians are debating. And if they don't regulate themselves, who does it? Is it some kind of government ombudsperson? Is it media? And I think media. I mean, we certainly do have some resources, but given the scale of the amount of information out there, I don't think that we're up to the task. Just one, scale; two, we don't have access to kind of the black box of social media companies. But it and then I think that the other thing that your question raises is this the authority question, like the credibility question, and like whether or not the certified authentic sticker of CBC or whatever means anything. And I think just separately, one of the issues, one of the reasons this is an issue is like in an era where media companies are getting smaller and smaller. Unfortunately, the CBC is also getting smaller and smaller. We have cameras fewer and fewer places. The CBC cameraman goes out, or a camerawoman or a camera person goes out and shoots something, we know it's real. But if we're not there and we're relying on somebody to send us stuff, then there's all kinds of processes that we have to do to authenticate that image. And during the early days of the invasion of Gaza, we had whole teams at the network, basically, whose job was, because no journalist was permitted to have access to where the fighting was, we had whole teams deployed to kind of go through. So it basically, if the network found something that it wanted to broadcast, then that image had to be verified. That's a very, very time-consuming process. But it's just the the result. Like if media companies get smaller and smaller, and if there are fewer and fewer places, then that means that either they have to just take a wing of prayer on an image they find on social media, or they have to engage some kind of verification process, which, like I said, is very, very time consuming.
Next question.
I am wondering, we talk about the toolkits that journalists use, and I'm the former youth correspondent for the Ottawa Citizen back from my Bachelor of Journalism days, so now an educational researcher. And I think about the things that journalists might learn from researchers with regards to credibility, trustworthiness, validity, if we're talking about quantitative research. And I think about my toolkits that I used to use as a journalist, and now the toolkits that I use as a researcher. And I'm just a little thought experiment. What if we adopted some of the practices of researchers in the toolkits of journalists? So for example, if we're doing qualitative research, we state our subjectivities. We say, this is who I am, this is how I come to the research, this is my lens, and we're very transparent about the bias that we bring. So, well done research, I suppose, can be very transparent. We talk about audit trails. So whom am I speaking to and why, for how long, how often, so this audit trail, we talk about sampling plans in research, so as a journalist, like, why did you speak to that person, but yet that person's voice is silenced? So looking at we also talk about open access data. What if I could see the recording of the interview and had the full transcript? It's a thought experiment.
No, I like it. I like it. Lucy, I'm going to start with you, if you're okay with it, just because I like to surprise you every now and then.
Okay.
And we'll go from there. We'll go quick. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to ask everyone to give their quick bullet kind of thinking on this question.
Yes, I really like what you're saying. I think it's partially done by certain news outlets, and I'm thinking more like long-form journalism and as well investigative journalism. It involves a certain degree of, let's say, self-narration that's better suited also maybe for podcasting, and some fantastic podcasts in investigative journalism do that and really tell you, well, I came to this topic for reason X or Y. I'm an avid reader of the Walrus, and a lot of their long-form journalism is very self-conscious. It's difficult for hard news, but again, it only reaches the people who are already interested, I think. Although you can bring people to that kind of journalism, but I think it's at least partially done. I don't know, Liam, maybe?
I mean, I think we've depended for a long time as journalists on our, on sort of being instantly credible, especially if we're affiliated with a major network or, a newspaper or a magazine of note. It's kind of assumed already that we are reporting in an objective manner, or in as objective a manner as we can be expected to report under the circumstances. And I think maybe that trust has eroded to the point where we do need to consider more carefully what degree of transparency we apply to our reporting, and borrow from some of the techniques that you mentioned. But I agree also that things do happen quickly, and I think that, we hold ourselves to a very high set of ethical standards as reporters, and those standards are published on every news website and in the back of every newspaper. You can find those standards wherever you want, and they sort of outline the manner in which we conduct ourselves as reporters in the field. And so I think there's already that layer of, this is what we do and this is how we do it, if you care to investigate.
Jonathan, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm don't want to sound like a fanboy, but I think one of the things that the CBC is very good at is that like we have an ombudsperson. People can file complaints to the ombudsperson. The ombudsperson conducts investigations. I was recently the subject of an investigation. Somebody claimed or was suspicious about a piece I produced. And the ombudsperson looked over my communication, my emails between me and a source, and fortunately, found I did nothing wrong. I think there would be some instances where I would not want, if I was engaged with an anonymous source, I would not want that conversation to be made public. I think part of journalism depends on discretion. But since the time I've been at CBC, one of the things we do at the I unit is we track who we're speaking to, making sure that like all our experts aren't from Toronto, that they aren't all white men, and so we do keep track of that, and we I think there's more to be done, certainly. I'll just one thing that sometimes after I've had a few drinks and I'm thinking I'm really smart, something I like to say is that like journalism isn't just a profession; it's also like a way of knowing. It's like an epistemology, and I think the more that we kind of think that through, I think we bring in some of the considerations that that you make, that we kind of acknowledge our subjectivity. But again, it's complicated, right? Because there's a point, or there can be a point, where your subjectivity comes into tension with your duties of fairness. And I think one of the things that a lot of journalists right now and a lot of news organizations are trying to figure out is how do you reconcile those two things. Anyway, the points you made are really, really interesting. I could blab on for 4 hours about them, but I won't. But I think that they're really quite important. And maybe because I'm a failed academic, I do think that there's a lot of value in academic methodologies being, helping inform, if not imported completely into journalism.
Jonathan, I'm a failed academic too.
I failed harder.
Yeah. So I want to thank the panel. I'm aware of everyone's time. I know we could keep going forever, and there might be other questions, but I'm going to ask those that had just questions remaining to come speak with the panel at the end, just so I could also respect the panel's time. And you might have to go back to work, who knows, as we kind of go through there, maybe. But I want to thank Jonathan, I want to thank Lucy, I want to thank Liam for an excellent thinking about how journalism, how media, how disinformation are becoming entangled or not entangled, or we're already entangled. And this idea of the epistemologies of journalism is a nice place, I think, for us to leave like the session in terms of what's to come. And I know the things that are about to come in a half an hour or so will resonate with some of that kind of thinking. And I hope everyone can just join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everyone, coming into the space. Thank you for being here for the first day of Disinformation. I want to let you know that this is just the beginning. There's a film screening starting this evening at 5:45 in the Dicev Cinema, which is here in the building. If you're going to that, please remember just to bring your coats with you, because we're going to close up the space. And the film seems amazing. Where in the hell is the Lavender House, the Longmont Potion Castle story? So definitely go check this out, and then also join us here back tomorrow morning